systems. So human power basically becomes an ambivalence. On the one hand, we want to empower humans and human societies with AI, but at the same time, we're designing AI systems to quiet the type of human noise that makes us most human. So the AI model needs predictability, it needs to reduce complexity, it needs patterns, and the classification system has to be complete, or it will not function effectively. But when is a human being ever complete? When is society done? Are they not always in the making? So let me show you what I mean. So here's a few examples of how humanity was imagined by some very powerful people in the tech debate, like 10 to 20 years ago, when the kind of AI we see in public use now was just about to break loose in the public domain. And what is it they're actually telling us about humanity? So if humans, for example, are just software like Kurzweil, he says, or said at that time, then of course we need an update. All software does at some point. Or if machines are our superiors, like Hawking said, then it is already too late. We're powerless and we just have to give in. And if AI is just one company's great business adventure, like Larry Page says, then it's economy. It's a trade secret. So we should not interfere with it, especially not with these kind of laws that we're told that hampers innovation, that stops innovation. So I'm sure you all kind of recognize all these themes in the current debates, right? They are still there. And these ways of describing AI or technology in general, just very often they leave us powerless because the way we talk about these technologies doesn't just shape our perception of them, it also shapes the ethical questions we ask and the political actions we take. So in human power, I wanted to take a different approach to AI and technology in general. So I wanted to start with what is already there, which is the human potential. But what do I actually mean by that? What I mean is that I don't see the human potential as this kind of mystical goal far out there in the future that we can only reach with and through advancing, for example, a technology like AI. So what I did was to explore 7 traits of human power: creativity, intuition, emotion, life, defiance, love, and wisdom. And what I'm proposing is that we use these traits of human power as a sort of mission statement for the politics of the AI machine age, for the way we design and adopt AI systems and how we govern them. Now, how did I research these traits? First, my aim was never precision or even accuracy. I have to say that. I didn't measure the way we feel, we think, we learn, we make decisions, we love, we defy, we remember, just to match them with the storage capacities, for example, or the speed of a computer. Instead, I explored human power from the position of that was embedded in human history and experience, looking at different ideas and conceptions we have developed in what we call the humanities. So this is things like psychology, history, sociology, philosophy, many other fields. And I've looked at art, literature, and films. Now, when I examined these 7 human traits that are also 7 chapters of the book, what I found was that they have a unique value and status in and by themselves. Unfortunately, I think that it's exactly also this uniqueness that I also see most challenged today, because this is also what is considered noise. It's exactly what doesn't fit in, what can't be measured, that disturbs this kind of perfect system. They represent, I think, like a rebellion against what has been called by others the tyranny of the algorithm. They represent an alternative, more humane method, a different perceptive power, a different approach to time and space, and a different approach to human beings. Now let's get to the point. What is human power then? So Tankman, as he was called, a person that walked in front of a line of big military tanks leaving Tiananmen Square in Beijing on June 5th, 1989, the day after hundreds of mostly student protesters were killed or arrested on the square. So we have this tiny little figure that walked in front of these very big displays of military power. Tank man, seeming, as he was dubbed later, he seemed so small and so fragile, but at the same time immensely powerful. And there are really a lot of examples of moments like this in history, full of human life, full of feelings and emotions, unpredictable. And one thing is, for example, Tankman, he's never been identified, so no one really knows what led him to this place and this situation to kind of walk in front of these military tanks. But we can imagine that it was something very human, like emotions of love, hate, intuition, defiance, lived experience, memory. And so what we see here are these two forms of power on display, human and technological. And what Tankman represents here is human power in all its fragility and all its force. Now, try to reflect on all the technological advancements we've seen in just past couple of 100 years, not only in military tanks, but in all areas of in our lives. And the world has really changed dramatically. And I think that even Tankman might today, he might not even have been. But if he was, we would most likely have known his real identity. We have facial recognition technologies that can identify a face by matching it with a database of faces. And AI like this is actually deployed in many smart cities all over the world. We have AI technologies that are developed to make predictions about people's emotions. And this, of course, means that today we could also try to detect Tankman's emotions. Maybe he would even have been stopped before walking in front of the tanks based on a system like that. But technologies used by, for example, police forces to control crowds of humans, these are not the only, if we can call them, social control technologies we have in our everyday lives. And they're not, of course, fortunately, they're not the most common ones. Human life, our lives, is generally represented, it's contained, it's shaped with within all these kind of digital devices and systems we use all the time. We interact with public services when we look up information, when we do our shopping, when we go to school, to work, when we entertain. We're basically just immersed in these digital social control systems. And what I'm suggesting here is that all these technologies are power because this is what they are, whether it's power of people like companies or police or even groups of people, which is something I wrote about in my last book, Data Ethics of Power from 2021. What these social technical infrastructures of power are doing is to basically condition human power, even I would say restraining it. Now let me get to my key point of my book, human power. What is it we want to safeguard and how is this different from, for example, AI power? So take a moment and think about human power. What does it look like? We see it very often expressed in sensations of humanity, compassion, identification with other people, defiance, anger, feelings of injustice. And in very important moments in history, this type of human power has really stood out. And we've seen it spoken out, articulated by individual human beings or collective groups of people. It is a very lived kind of power. These people were key drivers of change with a very kind of intense form of unique power. One that is full of emotion, intense reflection, one that suffers, sometimes even unpredictable, and based on sometimes even inexplicable actions. Of course, human power is also this. But we can choose to, and this is what I'm really asking you to do, to choose to insist on the other kind of human power. And we can do this with what philosopher Martha C. Nussbaum calls the creation of a conscious emotional technology politics, a politics that's aimed at cultivating and bringing out the most positive potential of human power. So let me explain what I mean by using an example. As said in my book, I describe 7 traits of human power, but here I'll just present one of them to you to illustrate what I mean. And this is intuition. So throughout history, we've always, when we look at intuition in different kind of forms and different expressions, it's always something that's considered particularly human. So in movies, we often see intuitive powers of different kinds of human beings depicted as this kind of mystical energy of gifted individuals, almost like a secret human superpower. So, of course, if this is intuition, then we could certainly also question intuition as the basis for making decisions in real life. If it's like, for example, the boy in the movie The Sixth Sense from 1999 that has this eerie intuition where he can see and communicate with the dead. So we can question this if this is really just what intuition is. Question it for reaching real valid conclusions and truth. Of course, we need evidence, arguments, analysis for that, not just this kind of anti-scientific hunch, mystical hunch. So the question is, why don't we just replace intuition with an algorithm? So the Nobel Prize winning psychologist, the late Daniel Kahneman, he, of course, many of you probably knows this very well, that he described human intuition in this way. It's not magic, as he said. It's just the human brain processing information fast. And when we do this, process information too fast and make too fast judgments based on these kind of past experiences, these will always, as was always also his argument, be less accurate than when we think slow, when we process information slower and apply this kind of critical, logical analysis. So according to Kahneman and many others, the human mind is a type of machine. And so intuition is fundamentally a weakness that we need to learn to discipline. He and his co-authors, they describe algorithms as the remedy for this, as they say, sheer magnitude of noise and damage that our flawed human judgment causes. And of course, if we think of words as powerful, we have to look at how these words, for example, like noise and damage, are used to describe our human judgment, intuition. Kahneman, he was not alone in this kind of thinking. Replacing human judgment with algorithms, many today sees as a big improvement. Just think of the big hype currently around AI agents and agentic AI. Now let's, for a moment, change this perspective on human intuition. Let's think of human intuition as a quality of human power, not just as this kind of human urge that we need to discipline. So Albert Einstein, he spent his entire life working with the laws of physics, and he believed in the power of human intuition and creative thought as the kind of key source of his scientific discoveries, the way he was working. So he said it enabled him to think beyond the most obvious, following the clues, as he said, that are not immediately given. It basically enabled him or enable this kind of nonlinear thinking, leading to innovation and breakthroughs that were out of the ordinary.
Oh, Gry, can I
Yeah,
just quickly intervene here? I'm
yeah,
hearing from some of the participants that they cannot see your slides. Would you
yeah,
be able to quickly reshare them once more?
yeah. Would you like to see the full screen then?
I think if we can just start by unsharing them and then resharing them, or maybe full
Okay.
screen.
Is it because it's too small or let's
Let's
see.
let's try
Let's
to
try with
reshare
the
them and
content
see.
only, then we'll see each other afterwards. And let me know if this better?
Let's hear in the chat and see if people think it's easier to see. Yes, there's a big yes.
Okay, okay.
Great.
I'm sorry then because then you haven't been able to read the nice quotes, but okay.
All right.
So back to Albert Einstein. So him and Leopold Infeld wrote a very beautiful book called The Evolution of Physics that was published in 1938. And in this book, they write that scientific problems are actually like solving a mystery. Um, so the challenge is to use one's intuition creatively by not falling into this trap of following only the most obvious clues. So let's try to do what Einstein and Infeld did and consider two very different intuitive approaches to solving a mystery. So both valid, I would argue they achieve the same goal, solving a crime, but in two very different ways. So first, Sherlock Holmes, everyone knows Sherlock Holmes. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's famous detective, he solves one impossible crime mystery after another with a logical, deductive kind of intuition. So he's analytical and rational. He observes facts and discovers clues based on reason and empirical evidence. And what at first appears mysterious and supernatural, he always manages to dissect into a very rational explanation. Holmes, the way he's described by his good friend Watson, he's also described as intuitive, but with a very particular kind of intuition. He's not an emotional man. He's not interested in the relation with other human beings or generally in the broader social or ethical implications of the cases he solves. He's basically emotionless, very much like his mortal enemy, the criminal mastermind Professor Moriarty. So here's a different detective, the Italian commissario Guido Brunetti. He's described by the American author Donna Leon, and what he does is to solve mysteries and crimes going around in ancient Italian cities. He's guided by something very different than Holmes. So Brunetti is deep, emphatic, a highly educated man. He's not really into the game of piecing together clues to solve crimes. Instead, he's more interested in grasping the social and ethical implications, the reasons behind the crimes, and the feelings and experiences of the people involved. And this empathy and understanding of the people he meets, and not the least his broad knowledge of the arts and culture, often takes him beyond the most obvious. Now, in a detective story, the process of solving a crime is just as important as the result. Holmes and Brunetti are both excellent detectives. They both find and trace clues and put them together to solve crimes. But their approaches, the depictions of the different steps they take when they solve crimes, the effects these different approaches have in their surroundings are not the same. And I, of course, want you to think of intuition in the same way, not as this race towards reaching a specific goal, but as different approaches or different ways of engaging with the world, other human beings and our mysteries and problems, for example. Think of which crimes are considered important by the two detectives and which are not, with which kind of human reflections and sympathy, if they have any, do they approach their task? How are the people in their surroundings treated? What changes do the different revelations cause in society and why? And could we argue that to the human world, Brunetti's intuitive humanism is just as valuable as Holmes' disinterested reasoning? Or what if we combine Holmes' objective analytical skills with Brunetti's empathetic analysis? So I can imagine something like that. You can probably also, and all kinds of detectives like that have been imagined in films and TV series and literatures by humans like me and you, writers and producers, and enacted by human actors through history. Think of the 8-month pregnant detective in Fargo, or elderly women like Miss Marple, people of different ethnicities, Jackie Chan in Police Story, Denzel Washington in The Inside Man, complex human beings and their human stories. So let's think, can AI imagine that? So this is ChatGPT and DALL-E that I asked in 2023, and then again in this summer to combine and imagine and make an image of that. And you see that it's very hard for this AI system to create anything beyond the ready-made. Even when asked to create something new, it can't think beyond the ordinary. I, for example, can only see a very white, masculine kind of character in this picture. And so with this example of just this one trait of human power, I really want you to think of the potential of human power as an approach that is not contrary to a rational, logical one, just one that is different. Building on this, we could, for example, understand human intuition as something other than just human irrational feelings and prejudice. We can think of it as a different inclination, a different, more holistic way of approaching the mysteries of human life, for example. So technology is a little bit like superstition. We imagine the shape and direction of human future through technology. Actually, I think we put a lot of blind faith into it. Every year we see a new version of emerging technologies that are presented as human superpowers. We hear how these technologies will ensure our human progress, unleashing the human potential once and for all. But what kind of superpowers are we talking about? So there's no doubt that technology extends human powers. This is not a question here. Glasses helps the weak-sighted to see. Medicine makes us healthier and stronger. Trains and airplanes takes us across the globe. The internet connects us. AI can do a lot of things as well. The evolution of human science and technology has always expanded our opportunities and our powers, but not in a frictionless way. Take, for example, the early aspirations of AI research that many of you, I'm sure you know very well. So AI has always been about pushing humanity towards this ultimate artificial superpower extension. The problem, I think, is that throughout AI history, we've been creating mechanical systems to mimic human abilities. And now with the generative chatbots, even more based on this very limited understanding of our own human potential, our intelligence, our creativity, intuition, our human emotions. All of this has been imagined as traits that can be matched and even surpassed by machines. So our aspirations were tied down from the Turing's test, which aimed to show that computers could match human intelligence, to John McCarthy coining the very term artificial intelligence. We've done what we could to attain what we imagine human level intelligence is, all to enhance computer problem solving capability driven by this notion that humans and machines are basically the same. What's more, artificial intelligence was imagined to hold an even greater potential, the ability to break free from human restraints like the human body, our biology, our politics, and society. And all of these reductive ideas about the human potential are really dominating, as I said, and as I started this talk with, the current global AI politics that are really defined within these frameworks of a global race towards gaining the ultimate AI power. And at the same time, we're told these incredible stories about the endless potential of the conglomerates' AI products, about AI that benefits humanity by saving our outdated human biology and nature, which is fundamentally aimed at replacing flawed and very noisy human beings. Ironically, due to this lack of imagination that also really seeps into the very design of some of the most popular AI products we see. Ironically, it's also, I think, what's least human we're becoming most familiar with, the data-driven society, the predictable human being. Just think about how our human language is really changing at the moment with these generative AI models. It's becoming polite, smooth, clean, utterly plain, and uninteresting. And at the same time, we can't avoid becoming very disheartened about the potential of humanity, about our human power, because we know we're judgmental, we're biased, we're hateful, we're destructive, we see it all the time. We're told that this is exactly why we need a more neutral, external technological agency like an AI agent to fix our human flaws. But while it's absolutely true that human power is fragile and easily corrupted, it is also really evident that there is no technology that can fix our natural human faults. We have an entire humanistic tradition that tells us this. actually the kind of human power that I've defended in my book and that I'm proposing that we revisit and reposition in the politics and the design of more human-centered AI is exactly the things that makes us capable of resisting destruction and violence and to really intuitively reject it. These are our wisdom, our love, our intuition, our creativity, our life, our feeling and defiance. So this is what I try to do in the book. I try to give human power a voice in a public debate that is very much dominated by discourses on technological power, by introducing this humanistic technology politics and asking you to try to understand humanity on its own terms. So now my hope is, of course, that we can use our human creative power to move forward and not just react to technology, to defend ourselves against risks and the power dynamics behind these, some of them harmful technologies, but also proactive design this trajectory to reinforce the kind of human power I've described in the book. So please remember there's always another way. There's still time to replace these commandments of technological power with human power. And what I always say and what I'm saying in the book is also think of of technology as a musical instrument and a musical instrument we can play music with. And like with any musical instrument, we don't tune the human musicians or the sounds it makes for the sake of the instrument. We tune the instrument to play the sounds that make the musical piece that humans can unite around. And with that said, I'm just thank you for listening, and then I'll just stop sharing and we can have a conversation. And I'm sorry about the non screens. Thank you for interrupting, Valdemar.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gry. And um, to anyone who has any questions or any comments, feel free to add those in the chat. Um, okay, so I mean, I have a question. I hope everyone can see me as well as you, Gry, but if not, please let me know. So I'm curious when you see sort of, and this is within, well, within Europe to some extent, you see countries like Albania that are trying to create AI ministers that is supposed to handle internal affairs, and then you see also just I think a few months ago there was a an article that showed in the UK that the number of speeches in the from the ministers had more and more AI generated or like AI words in them, and there was a very very strong spike after ChatGPT came out in these specific
Mm.
words being used. And so when it comes to the power that is sort of held within these different governments and how AI seems to be put into these roles of power, either with a human using them to write or direct their thinking, but also just blatantly outsourcing it to some AI system to do a minister's job. I'm
Mm.
curious, how do you think about that under the context of your presentation?
Well, I think I'm always mostly concerned the areas, of course, what I'm looking at is kind of humanity and kind of the humanistic approach in general. But of course, also through my work, some of the things that I worked mostly with is democracy and the effects that new technologies and not only AI, but the way that the influence that some of these technologies has had on democracy. And of course, it's something that I think also it went too fast. Some of these, exactly the way in which that it was introduced and just basically just thrown at us without any preparation. For example, we have a local elections in Denmark at the moment, and a journalist called me yesterday and asked me, is it okay for the Is it okay for politicians to generate images of themselves, which is not their original images, for their election posters? And as I told him, I find it very problematic because we're not ready. And democracy is one of the most sensitive areas where the balances of information and trust among citizens is something that we really need to be very careful about the democratic processes. So
Mm.
and then we have something so extreme, like exactly like a government that has an AI minister, which is, I've also heard, pregnant with, was it 83 AI agent children?
Yeah. I think,
So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I think that was a joke, but I think that it was under the cover of we want to extend this and have multiple ministers
Yeah, but the
inspired from
point
this.
is actually a lot of it is like we don't know, is it a joke or is it not? So, and that's the same with most of the kind of the posters we see and the information we get from different politicians. We are not ready. Our communication systems are not ready, so we
Mm.
don't have the kind of the defenses. So.
I'm curious, what are some of the potential negative effects you think might come out of, let's say, people using generative AI in their political campaigns, um, or to acquire power?
I think it's the black box effect, no? So you interests is one thing I worked with, as you also said. I worked a lot with power and power dynamics and understanding where interest comes from. And one of the most important things about a democracy is that we have to understand what interests are shaping, for example, the public debate, and we there needs to be transparency around that. If the politicians doesn't even know themselves what kind of, with an depending on what kind of AI models they use, but we do know that the information is filtered, and there is a cultural bias in most of the models that we use nowadays. So, but we politicians, they don't know it even themselves. So that's one side of it. Another thing is that we're basically also losing capacities. So politicians that are not, for example, participating in the messaging themselves, I think they're externalizing some of their own powers, and that is something we don't want. We do want politicians that have capacities like that. That is something we need now more than ever. No.
For sure, I agree with that. Please, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to post your questions in the chat, and I will read them aloud to Gry. Um, I have one more sort of question following up on this same conversation is how do you think this like compared to I know that it's not just one politician who is behind a campaign. Uh, there's a whole team of like writers and people who know how to like spin certain issues in specific ways. And I'm curious, some people might say that having access to these generative tools is just maybe a very good team member that you can put on your team. Um, how is the comparison between maybe a team member who might have certain ideas that they then project into um, your campaign by suggesting certain spins and so forth versus these large language models?
Well, the difference is that there is, in one of my chapters in my book is about wisdom, no? And the difference between a human being and a machine, where wisdom, there is some very specific characteristics, which is about, for example, the cultivation of knowledge and the experience and the actually the idea that you actually it's not only retaining knowledge, but it's actually also teaching others about your knowledge. So there's a huge difference between, it's not even comparable. So while you're telling me that there's a tool you can choose between a human being or a tool, and I don't think that you can even like compare. So, but as one of my key points is actually also to say, but you can supplement, no? So there's some things that AI, for example, and machines are really good at in terms of logics and analyzing and understand a huge amounts of data and information and predicting things on this, while there's other things that it should not even be compared to. So I do think in a politically sensitive situation, one is, of course, as I said, the transparency of interests. And I do understand that, a person also has a human beings has biases, and they know where they're coming from, but it's just two different. One is a machine and one is a human being, and it's not comparable. So
Yeah, yeah, interesting. It's interesting the language that we're using to describe these systems, and one could wonder if when AI was conceptualized in the 50s here at MIT, that if they'd chosen a different name, maybe it would look very different how these systems are sort of framed and used today. Okay, we got a question from Cyrus Clark. So I'll just read that up here. Cyrus says, curious about this idea of tuning and the comparison to musical instruments. I would see tuning as an extension of human intention towards an object, which makes sense for, let's say, a violin. But I don't know if I model interaction with, for example, LLMs in the same way. It's more like a negotiation with another intelligence. I see the similarity, but the subtle difference is quite stark.
yeah, you're right that it's a very kind of, I would say it's an easy trick argument. So I'm looking at technology in general, and of course you have there's a huge difference between an LLM and a violin, as you say, because the violin does not continue working on its own, no, like an LLM. So I do see the subtle differences. I think the reason why, and then of course it's a very short reference that I would, but the reason why I used the example of music in my book was actually in reference to politics. So and because what in a big chapter at the end of my book is about the technology politics for humanity, and my idea is to say that we have to try to kind of find different ways of finding harmonies rather than focusing on the technology as such. And so find when we do politics for technologies, it's understanding what is it we're doing, why is it we want the technologies, and not what is it, how do we build technologies towards reaching goals, or
Hmm.
do we build politics towards reaching technological goals? I'm sorry if I'm a little bit, but it's my it's very late in the evening for me. so
No, no worries.
so I stumble a little bit once in a while, no. So
We appreciate it.
yeah. I don't
um,
know if it made sense, but I do understand that if you want to be very specific in details, I understand that there's a difference. So I guess it's a more of a metaphor to kind of to apply in politics, I guess. Yeah.
that makes sense. And if Cyrus, if you have any, follow up to your question, feel free to ask that. Okay, so we have another question from Yakira Mirabito, who says, regarding your previous comment about democracy not being ready for AI-generated political ads or AI-generated political content, what guardrails or tools would you recommend, especially since we are already seeing cringy AI-generated political content here in the US?
Yeah, I mean, we're a little bit more strict with it in the EU, and as you might know, we also have now we just negotiated a legal framework, the AI Act in the EU. So there will be, especially also when it comes to democracy and political context, there will be more kind of requirements regarding things like that. But one of the very concrete things that, like a guardrail and something that is also part of the AI Act, is actually that you have to, if you create deep fakes, for example, or, of people that are living in real situations, like real living people in real situations, you have to put like a watermark, for example. It's a, it's a small technical thing. I think it's a very, I mean, it demands technical solutions, but at the same time, as I said, the reason why I was mentioning this thing that it goes too fast is that we need to kind of develop our literacy um, to kind of already now we come to a point where no one believes in anything anymore, and that's I actually find a big problem for democracy because we cannot even judge and we cannot even trust the indexicality of an image. It's not that we could that before, but it's even more difficult now, no? So we're starting to question that as the kind of document and the evidence of real happening things, and I find that very difficult. So it's not easy to come up with, guardrails, apart from the fact that we have the idea of putting watermarks, for example, on things that are totally AI generated. So that's one thing, but otherwise it's also I guess it's also the end of kind of honest political campaigning, at least in some places, no? So I don't know if it was ever honest, no, but
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a very interesting conversation. I mean, especially here in the US, there's been a heavy use of AI generated content in the current government. Um, so yeah, it is a very interesting question about how it's used. One might argue that there are some cases where the way that for generating videos and things like that, that it might be hard to maybe many people are familiar with the videos of bunnies jumping on a trampoline that ended up going viral, and a lot of people thought that that was real, but it turned out not to be. And
yeah.
then you have videos like the ones that President Donald Trump has generated, where perhaps the scenarios are a little bit more far-fetched, and maybe easier to spot, but it can still have an effect, right? So
Hmm.
I'm curious, how do you think about the examples that you're seeing of how these generative tools are used for? Well, one thing is distorting the truth, but even just for communication. Um, does
Yeah,
it feel?
well, what as I said, it's worrying because I think that it's the biggest effect that I see, and it's a very like effect that I saw immediately. It's the thing that I see even among children and young people that I hear that they don't trust anything. And so if you don't trust anything, then how are you going to be politically active, for example? Because it's very difficult to if you don't have an honest democratic debate, for example. Um, the idea that you can either make untruths with images or tell untruths. At least we had an ideal for presenting things truthfully, or and the debate is I think that the political debate and the democratic institutions and the democratic debate in general is really threatened by things like this. I think it's even more extreme in the US. In Europe, there is of course there is also politicians that have been creating AI generated videos, but it's always caused a very serious debate. And what I see most is if there are AI generated pictures or videos or things like that, there are watermarks on them, for example. Even in news outlets, this is how it's presented now. And I think that's part of that kind of negotiation that you normally have when technology is transforming society. You have a negotiations, you get new literacies, you get new guardrails and things, but we just didn't have time this time. So
Mm,
everything is just thrown into, so democracy becomes a test bed, our identities becomes a test bed, our, even as I said, language is becoming a test bed because you can see it in our language between people, and children are becoming, schools are becoming the test beds, universities are becoming the test beds to see, let's see how this is transforming humanity and democracy and social relations. And we didn't have time to build up, and this is what a society is about, is building up different kind of systems around transformations like that. So that's what I see as the biggest
Hmm.
challenge.
What are some of the challenges that you currently think are some of the things that need most immediate attention, or what are some of the new policies that you're currently sort of advocating for or working on in your work within the EU? Uh,
So, what I'm always and what I've been working on since I was in the high level group is what is overall it's called the human centric approach to AI. So that is what it's the EU approach is called. So it's basically what it names, and it's not only laws, but it's as an entire strategy, and it has this twin goal called excellence and trust. And it sounds very kind of political and everything, but it's actually a very nice concept. Is about creating quality AI that you can trust at the same time. And a big part of that is actually legal frameworks, because that creates level playing fields when you develop the technologies and when you adopt them. Right. The reason why I'm just saying law and regulation in general, as a response to your question, is that there's a huge push against regulation, and the AI Act is getting a lot of push also internally in the EU regarding, pausing the AI Act, waiting with certain requirements, watering down some of the requirements and everything. So I do think that at the moment, what I'm mostly pushing for is just generally regulation is a good thing. It's not inhibiting innovation. It's just creating a level playing field. So I think, and then uh, as a part of that, as I said, the human-centric approach is also about some basic human values. And so I usually call those the human-centric priorities. And those are basically the seven human traits of power that I talked about. So, just think about if you're thinking about a workplace, for example, where you want to have, use AI like algorithmic management, then you can, before you implement a system like that, you have to think of priorities, like human-centric priorities, like how do we safeguard people's creativity? How do we safeguard their wisdom? And I mean, not just how they retain knowledge like an AI system does, but their cultivation of knowledge, the way we teach each other, the integrity, and so on. Thus, how do we safeguard life? Like, for example, people with different kinds of lives in a workplace, like women in menopause, or people from with different ethnicities. How do we safeguard, for example, the human relations? A lot of relations are being replaced by AI systems. So those are the kind of things that I say are human-centric priorities that are not just one thing is regulation, as I say, regulation, regulation, regulation. I think it's really important. And the other side is all the things that those kind of human powers and human potentials that we want to safeguard with those regulations. And so I don't know if that made sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, we got two questions just coming in here towards the end, so I want to make sure we get we get them. Windsor Cho says, any thoughts on the importance of biblical wisdom versus machine knowledge, i.e., AI?
Biblical.
Biblical wisdom is what it
Like religious or spiritual? I'm not sure if I understand the
perhaps
question.
that's a fair interpretation. Yeah,
Let me see. This might be. Uh, I don't think I understand the question, to be quite honest. So
perhaps
maybe if you could ask,
yeah, perhaps
uh,
you can write a follow-up comment, and I'm happy to sort of reach it out to.
yeah, it's more to that I'm not sure if I would answer it in the right way.
Okay, the next question we have is from Ben Greens, who says, this might be beyond the scope of the conversation, but regarding truth and debate, I'm curious about what the implications of LLMs in our understanding of history, also applicable to cases of law. If a primary witness uses a chatbot to co-think about something they experience, what might that mean to our understanding of the event?
Oh wow, it's a very good question, and Not nice to ask me this late in the evening. So that is one thing that I find really, it's very interesting because that is kind of how artificial intelligence is part of generating not only kind of our spatial realities, but also our temporal realities. So I find that very, very interesting. Um, it's way too complex to answer though right now. The
Is there an
implications are grand, but they're too complex for me to answer in any smart way, especially at this time of the evening for me.
could there be an analog to how Photoshop might have allowed to, create, different images of things happen in the past, or the movie industry, or Hollywood, or, technologies previous like that, video. Um, there was a
Yeah, that
photo of Abraham Lincoln where they moved his head onto the body of someone else. Yeah.
Yeah, and that has kind of always happened with technologies all throughout history, that those kind of boundaries has been pushed a little bit. And I think, as I said, I think the temporal aspect is really interesting. One is the past, but another thing is also the future, because what I see, for example, these machines are very obsessed with prediction, no? So does that mean that, we get more of kind of, I use the concept of society of the destiny machines. So do we live in societies where like we used to have destinies by the gods, or whatever kind of destinies which was made for us, but then we had a time in history where we felt that we were free as human beings in terms of time, but now everything is being predicted as well. You can't really do anything without having your path predicted for you based on past data, and there the past comes into it. Is a very interesting. I mean, I would have to go back to Henry Bergson, Matter and Memory. That would be probably be some good suggestions as to how to answer that question. But it's yeah,
Perhaps a follow up over an email.
yeah, very
All right.
welcome to send an email.
All right, great. Well, yes, I want everyone to let's give a virtual round of applause for Gry. We're unfortunately out of time, but this has been very exciting, and yeah, thank you so much for joining us virtually. I know it's
Well,
very
thank
late
you
for
for
you, but we really appreciate it.
thank you, and thank you for the invitation in general. Thank you.
All right, take care.
You too.